Conversations with the Master, Talks with Leo Tolstoy, the third episode in a series, 1904. At Christmas, Alexandra Lvovna made a Christmas tree in the lodge to entertain the village children. I do not know who made the choice, but as there was not enough room, all the children were not admitted. Tolstoy, myself, and someone else, I don't remember who, came in rather later when the entertainment was at its height. At the door of the lodge stood the children who could not be admitted. When they saw us, the mothers of the children began asking Tolstoy to take their children with him. Tolstoy took 2 or 3 inside with him. It was bright and hot. Inside, the burning candles flamed. It smelt of burnt branches. We soon came out. Tolstoy said with a sigh, "How wrong it is. Some are inside, and the others are not allowed in. When our children were small, Sophie Andreevna always had a Christmas tree, and the village children came to it. Once they gave us the scarlet fever, and after that they were no longer admitted, except a few who were carefully chosen. I remember once there was a Christmas tree upstairs. I was lying downstairs on the sofa, where the library now is, and I was terribly ashamed to think of the children crowding outside and not being let in. I remember I could not endure it, came out, and gave them 3 rubles, and of course made things still worse. They began to dispute and quarrel over the division of it, and it was revolting, shameful, and painful. June 5th, Yasnaya Polyana. On the day of our arrival, May 27th, Tolstoy talked at dinner about the Decembrists whom he knew after their return from banishment. He's again studying that period. He spoke of Prince Volkonsky. His appearance with his long grey hair was altogether like that of an Old Testament prophet. What a pity I spoke so little to him then, when I need him so much now. He was a wonderful old man, the flower of the Petersburg aristocracy both by birth and by his position at court. And then, in Siberia, after he had already served hard labor and his wife had something like a salon, he worked with the peasants. All sorts of tools for peasants' work were in his room. Tolstoy does not believe the story about the affair between Poggio and Princess Volkonsky. He said, "I do not want to believe it. Such scandals are so often invented and people's memories spoilt. Moreover, Poggio loved Volkonsky so much that when later, Volkonsky's wife being already dead, he felt the approach of death himself. He came to Volkonsky to die there." Tolstoy went on to say, "I made Volkonsky's acquaintance in Florence at Dolgorukov's, Koko Dolgorukov, the doctor. At that time it was rare for an aristocrat to become a doctor. It was when Nicholas I limited the number of university students to 300, and Dolgorukov could not be admitted to any other faculty. He was a wonderfully capable man. He wrote poems, was a superb musician, painted pictures. He was married to... When I visited them for the first time in Florence, this was the scene I found. His wife and the well-known Marquis de Rogan were playing an extraordinary game. They made a mark on the wall and tried, by lifting their feet, to touch the mark. Each tried to lift his or her leg higher and higher. There was also present the very gifted painter Nikitin. He drew wonderfully in pencil. I remember he had an album and drew Volkonsky's portrait in it. He also drew mine. I wonder where the album is, if some collector were to get hold of it now." Then at dinner, Tolstoy told us 2 anecdotes from his life. The first was how he ate some earthworms. Tolstoy told it because Alexandra Lvovna and Ilya Lvovitch's children were going fishing. Tolstoy said he was carrying the worms in one hand and a loaf of black bread in the other. He had finished eating the bread and, thinking of something else, put the worms in his mouth and began chewing them, and for some time could not think what mess he had put in his mouth. Tolstoy said, "I remember the taste of them as if I were eating them now." My wife asked him if it was very unpleasant. "The taste of earth, but I don't advise you to taste it." Someone sneezed, and Tolstoy told another story. "I used to sneeze very loudly. Once at night I woke and felt I was going to sneeze immediately, and as Sophie Andreevna was going to have a baby, I was afraid to frighten her by sneezing. Half asleep, I cried out, 'Sonia, I am going to sneeze.' Sophie Andreevna, of course, woke up and was frightened, and I instantly fell asleep without having sneezed. Tolstoy also talked about Bologolov's reminiscences. He seemed to Tolstoy a narrow-minded man. Speaking of the terrible impression made by his description of the diseases and deaths of Nekrasov, Turgenev, and Saltykov, Tolstoy said, "How they dreaded death. And then there were those horrible, disgusting details of their illnesses, particularly Nekrasov's." Last winter, my wife and I stayed at Yasnaya Polyana, and when we had to leave, Tolstoy was sitting in his room with Pierre Boulanger. We came into the room to say goodbye, and probably they were talking of Boulanger's family affairs. We entered just as Tolstoy was saying, "If people only said more often, 'Do you remember?' People should make it a rule that if one person says or does something wrong in the heat of a quarrel, or when one is angry, the other should say, 'Do you remember?'" Tolstoy noticed my wife and me and said, "Now, you young people, you ought to make that your rule. No one can be such a friend as one's wife, a real friend. In marriage, it is either paradise or simple hell. There is no purgatory." Boulanger said that generally it was a case of purgatory. Tolstoy thought for a time and then said with a sigh, "Yes, perhaps, unfortunately." That same evening, looking at Andrei Lvovich's little girl, Sonechka, playing on the floor, Tolstoy said, "Faust speaks of the rare moment of which one can say, 'Verweile doch, du bist so schön.' Now there it is, that moment." Tolstoy pointed to the little girl. "There is a perfectly happy, pure, and innocent moment." June 20th. Some time ago, in May, Tolstoy said, "Religions are usually based on one of these three principles, on sentiment, reason, or illusion. Stoicism is an example of the religion of reason, Mormonism of illusion, Mohammedanism of sentiment. I have lately received many letters from Mohammedans. I had a letter from Cairo from a representative of the Baptist sect. It is an example of the religion of sentiment. I also had a letter from India, written by a wonderful and very religious man. He writes that true Mohammedanism is a perfectly different thing from what people usually think it to be. Indeed, I know some very religious Muslims, and how movingly simple and lofty is their worship. Today, at sunset, we walked in the garden. We talked of Gorky and his feeble man. Tolstoy was saying that today, on his walk, he met on the road. He likes to go out onto the road and sit down on a little stone, a milestone, and to observe or to speak to the passers-by, a man who turned out to be a rather well-educated working man. Tolstoy said, "His outlook on the world agrees perfectly with Gorky's so-called Nietzscheism and the cult of the personality. It is evidently the spirit of the time. Nietzsche did not say anything new. His is now a very popular world conception." Then Tolstoy said, "When I was a justice of the peace, there lived in Krapivna a merchant called Gurev, who used to say about young people of education, 'Well, I look at your students. They are all scholars. They know everything, only they have no invention.'" Turgenev, I remember, liked this expression very much. Recently, a party of gypsies camped on the road near Yasnaya Polyana. Gypsies often roam about Yasnaya Polyana. The party usually stay for 2 or 3 days, and in the evenings the Yasnaya Polyana household comes out to hear the gypsy songs and enjoy their dances. Tolstoy, looking at the gypsies, became a changed man and involuntarily began to dance to their tunes and to cry out again and again approvingly, "What a wonderful people!" The old gypsies all know Tolstoy and always enter into conversation with him. Tolstoy, from his youngest days, loved and knew the gypsies and their peculiar life. When we left the house, it was drizzling. Soon the rain got worse, and we returned. Andrei Lvovich said, "Now we have come to the house. The rain will stop." And indeed, on our way home, the rain stopped, and we went back to the gypsies. Tolstoy said, "Yes, it is always like that. As soon as you turn to go home, the rain stops. Something like this happens in Moscow, too. When you have to find someone in a large building and ring for the porter, he is never there. But no sooner do you go into the yard to make water than the porter is sure to catch you. So I advise you that if you have to find someone, don't ring for the porter, but do the second thing first. When Andrei Lvovich was made an aide-de-camp, Tolstoy said to him, "My only comfort is that you are sure not to kill a single Japanese. An aide-de-camp is always exposed to great danger, but seldom takes part in the fighting. I spent a great deal of time on the fourth bastion at Sevastopol when I was in the army on the Danube. I was aide-de-camp, and I believe I had not to fire even once. I remember once on the Danube, near Silistria, we were on our side of the river, but there was also a battery on the other side, and I was sent across with some order. The commander of the battery, Schuber, on seeing me, thought, 'Well, there's that little count. I'll give him a lesson.' And he took me across the whole line under fire, and with deadly slowness on purpose. I passed that test well outwardly, but my feelings were not pleasant. I also remember how one of the highest officers, Kotzebue, visited the bastion in Sevastopol, and someone, I think it was Novosiltsev, wanted to put him to the test, and began saying perpetually, 'Look, Your Excellency, just there at their line,' forcing him to put his head out from behind the fortifications. He put his head out once or twice, and then, realizing what was up, he, as the superior officer, began in his turn to order the other man to look at the firing, and, after teasing him for some time, he said, 'Next time I advise you not to doubt the courage of your superiors.'" Tolstoy recalled Lichtenberg's aphorism to the effect that mankind will finally perish when not a single savage is left. Tolstoy added, "I first turned to the Japanese, but they have already successfully adopted all the bad sides of our culture. The Kafirs are the only hope remaining." Tolstoy said, "I do not remember during any previous war such depression and anxiety as are now in Russia. I think it is a good sign, a proof that a realization of the evil and uselessness and absurdity of war is permeating deeper and deeper the social consciousness, so that perhaps the time is coming when wars will be impossible. Nobody will want to go to war." Now, Lysanka, who always sees the good in things, was telling me about a peasant, a porter, I think, who was called up and before going to the front took off his cross. That is a truly Christian spirit. Although he is not able to resist the general will and has to yield to it, yet he clearly realizes that it is not God's doing. Tolstoy described with horror how a priest marched with his cross in his hand in front of the soldiers. June 26th. Last week, I reached Yasnaya in the evening. The Sukhotins were there. During tea, Misha Sukhotin began to tell Tolstoy that on completing his studies at the School of Jurisprudence, he would like to go to Paris to continue his studies, and he began to argue with Tolstoy. I did not hear the beginning of the argument. I came in when Tolstoy was saying, "Every man is a perfectly individual being who has never existed before and will never happen again. It is just the individuality, the singularity of him, which is valuable. But school tries to efface all this and to make man after its own pattern. The pupils of the Tula Secondary School came to me lately and asked what they should do. I said to them, above all, try to forget everything you have been taught." Tolstoy thinks the Russian university in Paris perfectly useless and good for nothing. He said, "The best educational institution that I know is the Kensington Museum in London. There is a large public library where many people work, and they have professors of various special subjects. Everyone who works, if he has a question to ask, gives notice of it, and when several such questions have accumulated, the professor issues a notice to say that he will lecture on such and such subjects, and those who wish may come and hear him. Such an arrangement is most in keeping with the true object of teaching, to answer the questions which arise in the minds of the students. But in every other institution, lectures which are of no use to the student are read by professors who are for the most part entirely without gift. None of these lecturers would dare to publish their lectures. Goethe said, 'When I speak, it turns out better than when I think. I write better than I speak. and what I publish is better than what I write. He meant by this that what a man publishes is usually the cream of his thought, the thing he most believes in. Instead of going to Paris to attend lectures, go to the public library, and you won't come out for 20 years if you really wish to learn. One ought not to talk about oneself, but I must say this. When I was at the university in Kazan, I did practically nothing the first year. The second year, I began to work. There was a Professor Mayer who took an interest in me and gave me, as a subject, to compare the code of Catherine the Great with Montesquieu's Esprit des Lois. And I remember I became infatuated with the work. I went into the country and began to read Montesquieu. This reading opened up endless horizons. I began reading Rousseau and left the university for the simple reason that I wanted to work. For at the university, I should have to occupy myself with subjects that did not interest me and were of no use to me. Sergei Lvovich asked Tolstoy why he did not go in for his examinations at Petersburg University. Tolstoy said, "I began to work hard, passed 2 examinations, was awarded 2 marks of distinction, but then it was spring. It drew me to the country. Well, I gave it up and went away." Speaking of the good effects upon men of having received no education, Tolstoy said, "I know 2 musicians who never went to school, and yet they are very well-educated men, who, whatever subject you talk about, know it thoroughly. G. and Sergei Ivanovich Tanev." I played. Then Tolstoy said, "Anton Rubinstein told me that if he is moved himself by what he is playing, he ceases to move his audience. This shows that the creation of a work of art is only possible when the emotion has settled in the artist's mind." I do not remember how the conversation now got upon writing, but Tolstoy said, "Usually when I begin a new book, I am very pleased with it myself and work with great interest. But as the book work goes on, I become more and more bored, and often in rewriting it, I omit things, substitute others, not because the new idea is better, but because I get tired of the old. Often I strike out what is vivid and replace it by something dull." The conversation turned upon Herzen. Tolstoy read aloud extracts from his book, a collection of articles published in the Kolokol. Tolstoy is extremely fond of Herzen and values him very highly. He spoke of Herzen's unhappy private life and of the suffering he went through when the representatives, particularly the younger representatives, of the party with whom he had worked throughout his life, deserted him and ceased to understand him. Tolstoy saw Herzen in London when Herzen lived with Madame Tuchkov-Ogarev. Biryukov asked Tolstoy, for the biography of Tolstoy which he is writing, about his conversation with Herzen, which Madame Ogarev refers to in her reminiscences. Tolstoy said that he remembered a great many of their talks, but not that particular one. And he added, "Perhaps she merely invented the conversation, as the authors of memoirs and reminiscences so often do." On the whole, Tolstoy has not a high opinion of Madame Ogarev, although he says he knows her but little. He said, "I received a letter from her in which she, as though to justify herself, gives an account of the affair with the peasants which had lately taken place on her estate. There were some fields there which the peasants had had the use of from time immemorial. The fields belonged legally to the landowner. A bailiff was engaged, a Pole called Stanislavski, and he drove the peasants' cattle from the fields onto the estate. The peasants collected with thick sticks in their hands to free their cattle, determined not to give up the use of the fields. They arrived at the manor and began by demanding their cattle. Finally, Stanislavski fired and killed or wounded, I do not remember which, someone in the crowd. The crowd became furious and threw themselves on Stanislavski, who tried to save himself by flight, but he was overtaken on a moor and was murdered in a most brutal way. As a result of the affair, a military court was held and 2 or 3 peasants were hanged. Tolstoy had known of this before he got her letter and was horrified at the incredible verdict. Afterwards, Tolstoy said, "Lately I got a letter from a lady asking me why, strictly speaking, it is a crime to kill. Anyhow, man must die sooner or later, Is it not all the same? I replied that since every man represents a unique type, which never occurs again, we have and can have no absolute knowledge of why he is needed for the life of all. In life, everything is very carefully arranged, and we do not know the reason why just this individual should be alive, and it is for this reason that the destruction of this unique creature appears so terrible. Of being afraid in battle, Tolstoy said, "It is impossible not to be afraid. Everyone is afraid, but tries to conceal it. When wounded have to be carried off the battlefield, so many men volunteer for the work that the officers have to use great force to keep the soldiers back, since everyone wants, even for a time, to get out of fire." Of himself, Tolstoy said that he was never so much afraid as upon the night before the attack on Silistria, which after all did not take place. Then Tolstoy said, "The Japanese are less afraid, for they evidently value life much less than Europeans do. The absence of the fear of death goes to extreme lengths with some people. For instance, if a Chukcha wants to spite his enemy, he comes to his hut and kills himself near it, knowing that his enemy will then have much trouble with legal proceedings." July 8th. Tolstoy said with regard to his article about war, "Bethink yourselves." It is painful to feel that my words go unheeded. If one is dealing with the so-called men of science who regard war, apart from its moral significance, as one of the stages in the evolution of human relations, then, at any rate, one knows where one is. But what is one to do, and how is one to speak to people who evidently cannot understand my point of view? Whatever I say glides off them. They are, as it were, greased with a sort of oil, so that everything runs off them, like water, without wetting them. After this, Tolstoy said that, when he wrote to Nicholas Akindu from the Crimea in the winter of 1901 to 1902, he was told that Nicholas Akindu read his letter with pleasure. He also recollected Herzen's letters to Alexander II. Tolstoy wrote to Nicholas Akindu about the land question. With reference to the attitude in government circles to that question, Tolstoy said, "I can't possibly put myself at their point of view. I remember when I was young and an officer, I was never bothered by these questions. Somehow they did not arise in me. But I cannot imagine that I should pass by such a problem if I happened to come across it. I remember two such cases in my life. One, when Vasily Ivanovich Alexeyev, when I was at the height of my career as a landlord, expressed to me for the first time the idea that the ownership of land is evil. I remember how much I was struck by the idea, and how at once perfectly new horizons opened before me. So it also happened when someone, I don't remember who it was, I think a Frenchman, told me that prostitution was an abnormal thing, and not only useless, but really harmful to mankind. Schopenhauer, for instance, says that it is only owing to prostitution that family relations are still preserved in the community. I had not previously thought about it, but on hearing the Frenchman speak, I at once felt the truth of what he said and could no longer go back. I can imagine that one's thoughts may not tend in a certain direction. One may be ignorant of some point of view, but I cannot understand that incapacity and unwillingness to learn. July 9th. Speaking of Lichtenberg's aphorisms, Tolstoy said, "Aphorisms are perhaps the best way of expounding philosophical judgments. For instance, Schopenhauer's aphorisms, Parerga and Paralipomena, express his conception of the world much more clearly than the world as will and imagination. A philosopher, in explaining a whole complicated system, sometimes involuntarily ceases to be honest. He becomes the slave of his system, for the symmetry of which he is often prepared to sacrifice the truth." Speaking of Lichtenberg's beautiful German style, Tolstoy said, "Every literary language reaches its highest point and then begins to decline. In the German language, that time was at the end of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century. It was the same with the French language. Now, both in Germany and France, the language has become utterly spoilt. In Russia, we are now finding ourselves on the borderline. The Russian language has quite lately reached its apex, and now it begins to decay. Tolstoy praised Chekhov's language very highly for its simplicity, compactness, and expressiveness. Gorky's language he disapproves of, thinking it artificial and rhetorical. When Nicholas II appeared in many places to bless the troops going to the Japanese war with icons, Tolstoy said, "If A, the ruler of a huge country, takes a board, B, in his hand, and kisses it in the presence of crowds of many thousands of kneeling troops, and then waves the board over the heads of those who stand in front of him, and does this all over the country, what except trash can come from such a country? This has never happened before. In your own room you may do whatever you like. One man likes to wash himself with wine or eau de cologne, another kisses icons if he likes, but such idolatry on a large scale in the face of all and such deception of the crowd are simply incredible." During the war, Tolstoy always said that in spite of his attitude to war and to patriotism generally, he felt in the depth of his soul an instinctive sorrow at Russian defeats. I heard him say this in the presence of G, B, and some others. All of them energetically denied in themselves any such instinctive, patriotic bias. It seems to me that they were simply afraid of admitting it, even to themselves. October 22nd. Mechnikov sent Tolstoy his book, Studies on the Nature of Man, in French. Tolstoy read it through. Today, he said to me, "I got much interesting information out of the book, for Mechnikov is undoubtedly a great scientist, but the self-satisfied narrowness with which he is convinced that he has solved almost all problems that agitate man is surprising in him. He is so sure that man's happiness consists in a state of animal contentment that he calls old age an evil because of its limited capacity of physical enjoyment, and does not even understand that there are men who think and feel precisely the opposite. But I value my old age and would not exchange it for any earthly blessings." The conversation turned on the tendency of women to crowd to universities. Tolstoy said smilingly, "If I were a minister of education, I should issue a ukase by which all women were obliged to enter universities and would be deprived of the right to marry and have children. For the infringement of this law, the guilty would be liable to a heavy fine. Then all of them would be sure to marry." Tolstoy spoke on August 28th with exasperation about writing as a profession. I have rarely seen him so agitated. He said, "One ought only to write when one leaves a piece of one's flesh in the inkpot each time one dips one's pen." 1905, January 5th. During the Christmas holidays, Misha Sukhotin read Professor Korkunov's book on Russian state law. Tolstoy took it and began to read it. He sat nearly the whole evening in his room and came out in a state of agitation and disturbance, saying, "It gave me palpitation of the heart to read that." In this, as in almost all legal books which deal with rights of different kinds, it talks of anything and everything except the truth of the matter. It deals with the subject and object of right. I never could make out what precisely those words and others of the same sort mean, nor could I ever get anyone to explain them to me. But whenever the argument approaches the real question, the author immediately swerves aside and hides himself behind his objects and subjects. Further, Tolstoy said, "This is what surprises me. All my life I have striven for knowledge. I sought and still seek for it, and the so-called men of science say that I denounce science. All my life I have been occupied with religious questions, and outside of them I see no sense in human life. Yet the so-called religious men consider me an atheist." About that time, in January, Tolstoy said that he should like to write a whole series of stories for his reading circle, which he is now planning, and that he had already many subjects in mind. "Only 1 minute of life remains, and there's work for 100 years, he said. When later in the evening I played Chopin's Prelude, Tolstoy said, "Those are the kind of short stories one ought to write." There was then an interesting talk about Chekhov's story, The Darling, with reference to Gorbunov's letter dissuading him from publishing the story in the reading circle. Tolstoy, on the contrary, decided to include the story without fail and expressed his very high opinion of it. And in a few days he wrote a preface to The Darling in which he expressed his feeling for it. Of Gorbunov's letter, Tolstoy said, "I feel a woman's influence on him in this. The confused modern idea is that a woman's capacity to give herself up with all her being to love is obsolete and done with. And yet this is the most precious and the best thing in her and her true vocation, and not political meetings, scientific courses, revolutions, etc." Of Beethoven's music, Tolstoy said that at times he felt a little bored by it, as he thought often happens with what has once struck one greatly. He felt the same, for instance, about Gay's paintings. June 16th. In February, I made a note of Tolstoy's words. Immortality, incomplete, of course, is certainly realized in our children. How strongly man desires immortality is most clearly shown by his endeavor to leave some trace after his death. It might seem of no importance to a man what is said of him and whether he is remembered after he has gone, and yet what efforts he makes for it. Tolstoy said of the Moloccans that he had no sympathy with their religious formalism. In this respect, he draws a parallel between the Moloccans and the English. The son of Vicomte de Vogüé visited Tolstoy in the spring. Tolstoy said of him, "He is a typical Frenchman in everything, from his trousers to his way of thought. His father translated 3 deaths and wrote to me about it long ago. It was on my conscience that I did not answer him and was glad to have the opportunity of apologizing to his son." Tolstoy was surprised by young de Vogüé's saying that his father worked at night and smoked a great deal during his work. Tolstoy said, "I imagine that a Frenchman must in the morning rub himself red with eau de Cologne, drink his coffee, and sit down quietly to work. I always write in the morning. I was pleased to hear lately that Rousseau, too, after he got up in the morning, went for a short walk and sat down to work. In the morning, one's head is particularly fresh. The best thoughts most often come in the morning after waking, while still in bed or during the walk. Many writers work at night. Dostoevsky always wrote at night. In a writer, there must always be 2 people, the writer and the critic. And if one works at night with a cigarette in one's mouth, although the work of creation goes on briskly, the critic is for the most part in abeyance, and this is very dangerous. Tolstoy often says that he cannot find a suitable definition of music. Once in the spring he said, "Music is the shorthand of emotion. Emotions which let themselves be described in words with such difficulty are directly conveyed to man in music, and in that is its power and significance." Once, a long time ago, Tolstoy said, "Life is the present. All that a man has felt remains with him as a memory. We always live by memories. I often feel more strongly not what I have actually felt, but what I have written and felt in describing my characters. They too have become my memories, as if they had been actual experiences." The other day, the talk was on the same lines. Tolstoy said, "A so-called misfortune happens. One does not usually feel it, just as one does not feel a wound at the moment it is inflicted, and it is only by degrees that the sorrow grows in strength, having become a memory, placed, that is, not outside me, but already within. Yet, after a long life, I notice that the bad and painful things have not become me. They have somehow passed by, but on the contrary, all the pleasant feelings, all the loving relations towards people, my childhood, all that has been good, rise with particular clearness in my memory." Tatiana Lvovna said, "But how do you explain Pushkin's poem, memory unfolding its long scroll, and further, and reading my life with disgust, I tremble and curse?" Tolstoy replied, "That is quite different. To be able to experience and feel all that is bad in one with such power, that is a precious and necessary quality. Happy and of great importance is the man who can go through it with the vigor of Pushkin." July 6th. We went for a walk to the sandpits. During the walk, Gorbunov asked Tolstoy about Alexander Dobrolyubov's religious and philosophic book. Tolstoy said of the book, "It is vague, false, and artificial." On that occasion, the talk was about the literary profession. Tolstoy said, "It is surprising how in even a little piece of work one must think it over from all points of view before starting it. It does not matter whether you are making a shirt or a move in chess. And if you do not think it out, you at once spoil it all. You won't make the shirt, you'll lose the game. It is only in writing that one can do what one likes, and people never notice. Indeed, one can become a famous writer." Tolstoy went on to say, "The whole business of the writer is to perfect himself. I have always tried and try now to make a question which interests me clear to the highest degree that I am capable of making it. The writer's work consists in that. The most dangerous thing is to be a teacher. I do not think I have tried to be that. Yes, I have, but always badly." I. Gorbunov was saying that the posrednik had the censor's permission to publish an excellent little book in which a visit to Sarov is described impartially. Tolstoy said, "I have no sympathy when such things are described in a joking or jeering way. There is a great deal of sincere, simple belief there which should be treated carefully. In some old credulous woman you feel, in spite of the absurd superstition, that the foundation of her faith is a real striving for the highest and for the truth. Her outlook on the world is much higher than that of a professor who has solved all questions long ago." V.G. Christie, who walked with us, asked Tolstoy, "If such an old woman talked about religion, must one destroy her illusions and tell her honestly what one thinks?" Tolstoy replied to him, "The question does not exist to me. If I talk about religious questions, I always express my thoughts, if I believe the truth of what I say. And if my words are not understood, it is none of my business, but I can say only what I think." Last year, two young men came to Tolstoy, and now they have been again. They are very nice and in search of a better life. They turned out to be ballet dancers from the Moscow Grand Theatre. The necessity of maintaining their family prevents them from changing their profession. Tolstoy praised them highly. Then, with a smile, he said, "If I had children now, I should send them to the ballet. At any rate, it is better than the university. Their feet alone might be spoilt in the ballet, but at the university it is their heads." Tolstoy compared marriage to a little boat in which two people sail over a stormy ocean. Each must sit tight and not make sharp movements, or the boat will upset. Speaking of the present schemes for a constitution in Russia, Tolstoy said, "The misfortune is in that the radicals and their set will only try to say something very clever, to play the part of Russian Beebles, and the party game will constitute the whole of the activity of the representatives of the people." Of the war, Tolstoy said, "The comforting side of the Russian failure in the war consists in this, that however much people distort the genuine Christian teaching, yet its meaning has already permeated the consciousness of the people so deeply that war cannot become to them, as to the Japanese, a sacred cause by sacrificing his life, to which a man becomes a hero and does a great deed. The view of war as an evil permeates the consciousness of the people, deeper and deeper." Tolstoy said about the Japanese, "The Japanese are perfectly incomprehensible and unknown to me. I see their wonderful capacity for adapting and even for carrying further the superficial side of European culture, chiefly in its worse aspects. But the soul of the Japanese is absolutely dark to me. Japan, by the way, proved that the whole of the boasted European civilization of 1,000 years could be taken over and even surpassed in a few decades." The conversation was about crowd psychology. Tolstoy said, "It is an interesting and still little explored problem. It is a hypnotism which has a terrible power over men. There is one moment when it is still possible to resist it. I am now no longer infected by others yawning, because I always remember it. When you see a crowd running, you have to remember that you do not know why they run, and to look back, and immediately you have dissociated yourself from the crowd. You are at once saved from the danger of succumbing to the hypnotism. We played chess on the terrace, and in the hall, Sophie Nikolaevna sang Schubert's Wanderer. Tolstoy said, "Ah, that Schubert. He did a lot of harm." I asked how. Because he had, in a high degree, the power of making music correspond to the poetry of the text. This rare power of his has brought to birth a great deal of music which pretends to correspond to poetry, and that is a revolting kind of art. They sang Glinka. Tolstoy said, "Now, sinful man." The interesting state of the game prevented him from finishing his sentence. Later he said, "I feel that Glinka was coarse, a sensual man. One always feels the man himself in his music. The young Mozart, bright and direct, the simple Haydn, the stern, conceited Beethoven are all heard in their music." Tolstoy is writing an article which is called The Beginning of the End. There was a newspaper correspondent to whom Tolstoy expressed a few of the ideas which made the basis of his article. The present movement in Russia is a world movement, the importance of which is still little understood. This movement, like the French Revolution formerly, will perhaps give, by means of its ideas, an impetus for hundreds of years to come. The Russian people has in the highest degree the capacity for organization and self-government. They gave up their power to the government and waited, as they formerly did for the liberation of the serfs, for the liberation of the land. They have not been given the land, and they themselves will carry out that great reform. Our revolutionaries are perfectly ignorant of the people and do not understand this movement. They might help it, but they only hamper it. In the Russian people, it seems to me, and I think I am not biased, there is more of the Christian spirit than in other peoples. Probably the reason is that the Russian people got to know the New Testament about 5 centuries before the people of Europe, who until the Reformation hardly knew it. Tolstoy criticized the complexity and artificiality of modern art in general and of music in particular. He said, "Certainly, if I love art, I can't love no art, but I must love that which exists. Still, I have always before me the ideal of the highest art, to be clear, simple, and accessible to all. I was saying how long and systematically one must teach piano playing in order to be able to play well. Tolstoy found that system dangerous. He said, "In doing this one may lose the direct fresh feeling with which you regard a new work of art. I know it from my own experience. When one begins to write something, one works with excitement and interest, and the work goes well. But then the same old thing begins to tire one, and it becomes boring. Of course, there is the love of one's work, and the love is stronger than the boredom, and by love the boredom is overcome, but still boredom there is." I spoke about the complexity of certain of Chopin's works, whom Tolstoy loves very much. "Well, he too makes mistakes," Tolstoy replied smilingly. "Once I stayed with the Olsufevs in the country, and referring to the weather and the gathering in of the harvest, I said to the old butler there, he was a skeptic and pessimist, that God knows what he does, to which he replied, he too makes mistakes." Of creative activity, Tolstoy said, "The worst thing of all is to begin a work with the details. Then one gets muddled and loses the power of seeing the whole. One has to behave like Pokitonov, who has spectacles with double glasses divided in two, looking at the distance and at his work, to look now through these, and now through those, and to put on now the bright, and now the dark glasses." July 28th. Biryukov showed Marie Nikolaevna, Tolstoy's sister, some old letters written by her brother Nikolai in French. Tolstoy recalled then that from childhood he was so much used to writing French that he kept the habit until he was quite grown up. When he lived in Paris with Turgenev, he once sat down to write a letter to his brother. Turgenev came up and, seeing that he was writing in French, was surprised and asked Tolstoy why he did it. Tolstoy said that until that moment it seemed to him that it was impossible to do otherwise, so used was he to writing letters in French. On account of Biryukov's visit, he is writing Tolstoy's biography, and the arrival of his sister, Marie Nikolaevna, Tolstoy again turned to memories of the past. He said, "It is surprising how all the past becomes me. It is in me, like something folded, but it is difficult to be perfectly sincere. Sometimes I remember the bad only, another time the opposite. Lately I have remembered only the bad acts and events. It is difficult in this to keep the balance so as not to exaggerate one way or another." Tolstoy said, "It is impossible to know anything about God. He is a necessary hypothesis, or more truly speaking, the only possible condition of a right moral life. As an astronomer must base his observations upon the earth as a motionless center, so also man cannot live rightly and morally without the idea of God. Christ always speaks of God as of a father, that is, as if he were the condition of our existence." August 2nd. Tolstoy and Marie Nikolaevna were recalling a certain Voikov. He was once a hussar and then became a monk. When Tolstoy was young, Voikov was continually at Yasnaya, permanently drunk, ragged, in monk's clothing, and telling lies unmercifully. Tolstoy remembered a story that Voikov told. "We were once in a box, Mikhail Ilarionovitch, Kutuzov, Alexander Pavlovitch, Alexander Berpin, myself, and someone else. Sontag sang. She came out to the front of the stage. Her bosom. Oh!" He makes a gesture with his hand showing the size of her bust. "Alexander Pavlovitch said to me, 'Voikov, what is it?' And I said to him, 'An organism, Your Majesty.' And once, after all his mad ways and lies, he suddenly came up to me in the garden and said, 'I am tired of life, Levochka.'" Marie Nikolaevna asked Tolstoy why he had never described Voikov. Tolstoy said, "There are some events and people in life, as there are scenes in nature which cannot be described. They are too exceptional and seem to be impossible. Voikov was like that. Dickens described such types." August 3rd. The conversation turned on Lobachevsky and on his theory that space is of many dimensions. Tolstoy remembers Lobachevsky, who was professor and principal of the Kazan University when Tolstoy was an undergraduate there. Then the company began to recall various mathematicians, amongst whom there are often queer fellows to be met. Tolstoy mentioned Prince Esu Urusov, the Sevastopol hero, who was a mathematician and a splendid chess player. Tolstoy said of him, "He used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, light his samovar, which was prepared for him the night before by his orderly, and begin his calculations. Urusov was trying to find a way of solving the different forms of equations. Later, he went quite mad. Nothing came of his calculations. When, in the belief that he had arrived at a positive result, he decided to read a paper to the Mathematical Society, there was so awkward a silence after his paper was read that all felt ashamed." Tolstoy went on to say, "I was always surprised that mathematicians who are so exact in their own science are so vague and inexact when they try to philosophize." Tolstoy also mentioned Professors Nekrasov and B, whom he knew personally. Tolstoy recollected how one evening he visited B. His wife was an unpleasant woman. That evening she was décolletée, and, as is always the case on such occasions, one feels something superfluous, unnecessary. One doesn't know where to look. Looking at her, I remembered Turgenev's story, how in Paris he always bought himself a loaf in the morning, and the baker's girl would hand it over to him with her bare arm, which was more like a leg than an arm. August 20th. A certain gentleman from Petersburg, I don't remember his name, now and then sends books to Tolstoy. Recently he sent him the Sovremennik for 1852, in which Tolstoy's childhood was published. Tolstoy read the books with great interest and said that the Sovremennik was at that time a very interesting review. Marie Nikolaevna, who was on a visit to Yasnaya, described how she read childhood for the first time. She lived then with her husband in the country, in the Chernsky district of the Tula province, and Turgenev used to come to visit them fairly often. Her brother, Sergei Nikolaevich, also lived there. During one visit, Turgenev read them the MS of his Rudin. Next time he brought a number of the Sovremennik and said to them, "There is a wonderful new writer. A remarkable work by him is published here, Childhood." and he began to read it aloud. From the very first words, Marie Nikolaevna and Sergei Nikolaevna were amazed. But he is describing us. Who is he? At first, we did not think of Lavochka, Marie Nikolaevna went on. He was in debt and had been sent to the Caucasus. We were rather inclined to think that our brother Nikolai had written Childhood. It is said that Turgenev, in his Faust, described Marie Nikolaevna. The conversation turned on Dostoevsky's hatred of Turgenev. Tolstoy greatly blamed the libel on Turgenev in The Possessed. This hatred always surprised Tolstoy, and so did that between Goncharov and Turgenev. Tolstoy went on to say, "Now books are written by people who have nothing to say. You read, but you do not see the writer. They always try to give the last word. They reject the real writers and say that they have become obsolete. It is an absurd notion to become obsolete. Modern books are read just because one can get to know the last word from them, and this is easier than to read and know the real writers. These purveyors of the last word do enormous harm. They make people unused to thinking independently." Someone mentioned Kant, and Tolstoy said, "What is particularly valuable in Kant is that he always thought for himself. In reading him, you deal all the time with his thoughts, and this is extraordinarily valuable." About reading modern literature, Tolstoy said, "I am much more ready to read the memoirs of some old general in the Russkaya Starina. He romances a little, like Zavelishin, about his merits and successes, but this can be excused, and there is always something of interest in it." Tolstoy said further, "Brain work often tires the head, and when tired, you can't work as fruitfully as with a fresh head. Generally speaking, in brain work, the moment is very important. There are moments when your thoughts come out as if molded in bronze. At other moments, nothing happens." December 31st. Tolstoy said, "I am always interested to see what can become obsolete in literature. I am curious to know what in modern literature will seem old-fashioned, as, for instance, Karamzin's "Oh, so ever," etc., seems to us now. Within my memory, it has become impossible to write a long poem in verse. It seems to me that in time works of art will cease to be invented. It will be a shame to invent a story about a fictitious Ivan Ivanovitch or Marie Petrovna. Writers, if such there be, will not invent, but will only describe the significant or interesting things which they have happened to observe in life. I said to Sophie Andreevna today, and I believe she was hurt by it, the first concern in life must be for the things of the soul, and if household duties interfere with that, then damn household duties. Last night, we sat on the balcony. Tolstoy said that he had had a nice letter from a simple man who had read several of his books, and who asked, at the end of his letter, where there were people who live a Christian life, for he would leave everything and go and live with them. Tolstoy said that he replied to him much in the same way as he had done to Kleczkowski. Tolstoy added, "I think that even if one was a woman in a brothel or a jailer, one ought not suddenly to give up one's work. Certainly anyone who realizes the evil of such a life will not go on with it, but the important thing is not the external change." Tolstoy said he had received 3 letters, one from Mr. Grekov, who sent him 3 copies of his book, The Message of Peace, and wrote that his book was so remarkable that if it were widely read, it would revolutionize human life. The second letter was from an intellectual who asked for a loan of 800 rubles, and the third from a simple, illiterate peasant, a good, serious letter. Tolstoy said that besides letters asking for money, he also receives letters from authors sending him their books and begging that Tolstoy will use his authority to make their books known. "An odd idea," Tolstoy said, "that I should try to spread opinions which I neither sympathize with nor share." August 5th. Marie Nikolaevna told how the steward for Kanik had once stolen 400 rubles from Tolstoy, and Tolstoy took it rather indifferently. Soon afterwards, Sergei Nikolaevich, Tolstoy's brother, was very much worried about his affairs, and when he was told that it was not worthwhile to be so worried, he said, "It doesn't matter to Lavochka that Fokanik stole 400 rubles from him. He will write a story and get the money back, and he will describe Fokonik into the bargain. But where shall I get my money? Tolstoy replied to this, Mashenka, how can you remember all this? But I heard an expression today that keeps on coming back into my mind. And Tolstoy told how during lunch today an unusually importunate beggar arrived. He stood by the balcony and began saying how happy he was to see and salute Tolstoy, etc. He was given something, but he was not satisfied, went to the kitchen and began begging with extraordinary importunity. After lunch, when Tolstoy was coming down from the balcony, Ilya Vasilievich, pointing to the beggar, said to Tolstoy, Yes, that fellow could beg the parson's mare off him. August 19th. At tea, the conversation turned upon modern literature. Tolstoy asked Butyrlin to send him anything new he could find by Anatole France, whom Tolstoy values very highly. He spoke again. Tolstoy said, I cannot remember getting a strong impression from a book for a long time. I do not think it is because I am old. It seems to me that modern literature, like the Roman literature in the past, is coming to an end. There is no one, neither in the West nor here. Butyrlin asked Tolstoy if he remembered Oscar Wilde's De Profundis. Tolstoy had not read it, but said, I forget everything now, but I remember having tried to read Wilde, and it has left me with an impression that he was not worth reading. Speaking of modern Russian writers, Tolstoy mentioned Kuprin. His scope is small. He knows the life of the soldiers, but still he has real artistic power. The others simply have nothing to say and are on the lookout for new forms. But why look for new forms? If you have something to say, you should only ask for time in which to say what you want, but you won't need to seek new forms. Apropos of Elzbacher's book on anarchy, which Tolstoy was rereading, he said, Christian anarchy is a narrow definition of the Christian conception of the world, but anarchy follows certainly from Christianity in its application to social life. September 3rd. Tolstoy again spoke about the old German mystic, Angelus Silesius. Tolstoy asked someone to fetch his book, a large old volume, and read aloud several aphorisms, translating them as he read. When he came to the passage, If God did not love himself in us, we could neither love ourselves nor God, Tolstoy exclaimed. Ah, how well that's said. Referring to some account in the papers of a conversation with him, Tolstoy said, If I were to live for another 80 years and were never to cease talking, I could not manage to say all the sayings that are attributed to me. September 6th. Tolstoy said, with reference to the addresses and congratulations on his 80th birthday, August 28, 1908, which keep on coming, I believe I am right in saying that I have no vanity, but I can't help being touched involuntarily. And yet, at my age, I live so far away from all this. It is all so unnecessary and so humiliating. Only one thing is necessary, the inner life of the spirit. On August 29th, when more than 2,000 telegrams of congratulation arrived, Tolstoy said, I feel with joy that I have utterly lost the power of being interested in all this. In the past, I remember, I experienced a feeling of pride. I was glad at my success. But now, and I think it is not false modesty, it is a matter of absolute indifference to me. Perhaps it is because I have had too much success. It is like sweets. If you have too many, you feel surfeited. But one thing is pleasant. In nearly all the letters, congratulations, addresses, the same thing is repeated. It has simply become a truism that I have destroyed religious delusions and opened the way for the search after truth. If it is true, it is just what I have wanted and tried to do all my life, and this is very dear to me. 1909, February 10th. Once in the winter, Sophie Andreevna, in Tolstoy's presence, criticized V.G. Chertkov bitterly, which, as usual, pained him very much. This was in the morning. In the middle of the conversation, Tolstoy got up and went into his room. Some time later, he came into the dining room, stood at the door, and said in an agitated voice, There is an old nurse in our house. I scarcely know her, but I love her because she loves Sasha, and when there is nothing like that in a house, there is no real love." After saying this, Tolstoy turned and quietly went to his room. Tonight, Tolstoy said, "When one listens to music, it agitates, excites, elates, but one does not think. But when I play Patience in my room, the finest thoughts come to me." During work, especially if he found some difficulty, Tolstoy used to play Patience. This was his habit throughout his life, when he was writing Part the Third. Of Resurrection, Tolstoy was undecided for a long time about the fate of Katyusha Maslov. Now he decided that Nekhlyudov should marry her, now that he should not. At last, he decided to play a game of patience. If the patience came out, Nekhlyudov should marry her. If not, then he should not marry her. The patience did not come out. Once Tolstoy told me that he had found a passage in a book which he was writing, very difficult. He hesitated for a long time what to do, but made up his mind and wrote it. Then he decided to test it by means of a game of patience. If the patience came out, that meant that what he had written was good. If it did not come out, then it was bad. The patience did not come out, and Tolstoy said to himself, "Never mind, it is good as it is," and he left it as he had written it. May 24th. Tolstoy was speaking about Dietrich's German book on Goethe. The author sent him the book and asked him his opinion. Tolstoy said, "It is amazing." So far back as 1824, Goethe wrote that sincerity was become almost impossible in art because of the multitude of newspapers, journals, and reviews. The artist reads them, involuntarily pays attention to them, and cannot be perfectly sincere. What would he say if he lived now?